Welcome to this next in our series of interviews with University of Iowa faculty and graduate students, in which we're all weighing in on the pandemic through the lens of individual people's research and current work. And today I'm very happy to have with us Kristy Nabhan-Warren, who is in both religious studies and GWSS and has been on the Obermann Center Advisory Board and I think done some other things with us too. Thank you. Lisa Ortiz, who is happily a colleague this year via her work as a postdoc on the Sawyer Seminar. So she's been housed at the Obermann Center, and she also is recently announced as a Provost postdoc and will be working in both GWSS and Latino studies. So we decided on a sort of a different format for this than I have been doing, in which Lisa and Kristy are going to primarily interview each other. So we're going to start with Kristy.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jennifer, for inviting us to do this. I've been looking forward to this. So Jen gave us a prompt question. How are we understanding what's happening now with the pandemic through the lens of our research? And I have to say, this is the first time in the course of my career as an academic that the work I've been doing, so I'm an anthropologist of religion, an ethnographer, and I've primarily worked with Latinx individuals from my master's thesis to, the various books in this current book. And so I've been conducting field work in rural Iowa for the past 6 years, and the book will be coming out next fall, 2021. And right now it's called Cornbelt America, the Work of Faith in the Heartland. 3 of the 6 chapters are deep dives into the meatpacking industry in Iowa, because it became really clear to me that if we want to understand the contemporary intersectionalities or how migration, work, and people's religious lives interact, we have to go to the places of work. And religious studies scholars only very recently have started to talk about class and work. They've done a really good job looking at ethnicity, race, and those intersections with religion, but very rarely have they really looked at work. And coming from a working class background like myself, I've always wanted to look at class more as a first gen in my own family. And so, so it's been crazy because I did field work at Tyson hog processing plant in Columbus Junction and really worked closely in that community for many years. And I spent a whole week of intensive field work at the Tama, Iowa premium beef plant. So I was treated as a new hire, went through their employee training. And as far as I know, the first anthropologist of religion really get access to these packing plants in the ways that I was. So so it's been really wild because I really wanted to know how corporate America treats workers and how individuals, the most vulnerable members of our society, refugees from Central Africa, refugees from Vietnam, refugees from the Northern Triangle, Central America, how are they dealing with the various stresses, and how does religion work in their lives? How do they bring religion to work with them? How do they use it as a coping mechanism? I was also very interested in exploring, there's a lot of literature right now in religious studies about corporate America and the linguistics of workplace religion. So I became very interested in the language of sort of corporate paternalism and corporate evangelical Christianity that comes through very strongly at Tyson. They have a chaplaincy program. One of my close contacts, interlocutors, is the chaplain, Joe Blay at the plant. And we've been talking regularly ever since the COVID hit the Tyson plant really hard. And he's a very critical insider of the plant. I also look at sort of, the dimensions of power, the CEOs and the CFOs who literally aren't doing the bloody work on the line. And as a lot of folks have been writing lately in op-eds, there's been a lot of attention to meatpacking and I had an op-ed that came out about a week ago on this. So while safety standards for the meat has improved drastically since the mid 20th century, the safety for the workers has not. And so with Trump's recent executive order, where there are very few protections for workers, advocating for speeding up the line. So I'm trying to do a lot of things in this project. I'm trying to look at work, how people bring religion to work, how corporate America uses and abuses language of faith to further oppress workers, how local religious leaders have stepped up. I actually got access to the Tyson Columbus Junction plant from a good friend of mine, Father Joseph Sia, who is now with the Davenport Diocese. He's in charge of they call it Hispanic ministries. They don't call it Latinx ministries. I'm kind of pushing them on that, but they call it Hispanic ministries for now. But Father Joseph has really been a partner in anthropology with me. He and I did the tour of Tyson. He introduced me to a lot of the workers. And so I've really partnered with a lot of religious leaders. He does a farm workers mass every year in Conesville, where men are brought from central Mexico to work for Bell's Melons. And so he's really kind of taken me around. And so a lot of my contacts have been from a priest friend, actually. So that's where I am with my work. And it's been really a heady thing, writing a book and having it come out. That's actually on something that's like in the news. And I'm a little nervous about it because I hope it's not dated by the time it comes out, next fall. But that's where I am with my work right now. And I'd love to hear more about, Lisa, your work as you transition from your dissertation to your book and how your people in Illinois are coping with this pandemic. I'd love to hear where you are now with your research.
Sure, thank you. I echo Kristy and thanking you, Jennifer, for this opportunity. My research was based on two sites, one in Jayuya, Puerto Rico, which is in the interior of the island, or the biggest of the three islands, and Rantoul, Illinois, which is in central Illinois, and about 20 minutes away from where I am currently. And originally what I wanted to look at or understand was why there were Puerto Ricans in this town that was really unknown to me. And it turned out that what I found was that the first group that I was familiar with had been recruited in Jayuya in 2007 to work for a meatpacking plant in Rantoul. And there were about 3 waves of folks who got recruited to work in 2007, and that recruiting initiative soon ended toward the end of the year because of other factors. But in that process, Puerto Ricans were brought to work, and there were rivalries, right, with other folks of Latino populations, primarily because it was seen as, a rivalry of displacing undocumented folks so that Puerto Ricans could come in and do the same work. And so in a way, we see the fragility of US citizenship when folks who are from similar backgrounds in terms of ethnicity, race, are put in similar working conditions. That led me to continue to think about and talk about folks who were moving after that initial recruitment phase in 2007. And there's been, of course, more people who have come because they know of folks who either stayed in 2007, very few, or that have returned since. And so there's a growing population that might not necessarily be impactful in terms of numbers, but certainly in discourse and when people talk about Puerto Rican presence around town. And so the dissertation looked at those different case studies, the 2007 group, the media as it was sort of informing the migration, quote unquote, crisis that was happening on the island. I then looked at folks who came in 2012 and after, and ended the dissertation with a view on schooling per se, very formally, right? Looking at experiences that children were talking about at schools, and also talking with school personnel. These kids, or the 3 pairs of students that I was able to talk with, were siblings and were children of folks who came in 2012 and after, right? So it's kind of like closing the loop, so to speak, in relation to those experiences, and really thinking about knowledge or ways of knowing differently, and somewhat trying to rethink what we think about when the census or when profiles come out about Puerto Rican migrants that, you know, describe folks as professionals or most educated leaving. I'm kind of interested in disrupting that and really seeing and thinking about education more broadly, and also focusing on the ways in which people themselves describe themselves as professionals in ways that differ from governmental definitions, if you will. The part of schooling is probably not going to be part of the book. I'm really interested in still keeping the story of the folks who came in 2007, focusing again also on the people who came thereafter in 2012 and the racial dynamics that happened through church, but also of course through work. And then I returned to people in Puerto Rico, those who stay, family and friends of people living in Illinois now who have either returned back to Jayuya or who never left Jayuya, because I do think that there's still value in understanding why people stay. So that's where I'm at right now.
I love that you have the transnational look, and I love that you've stayed in touch and that you're tracking movement. Lisa, do you identify yourself as a sociologist, a historian? Like methodologically, where do you place yourself? I'm curious, like in terms of your work.
Yeah, so my degree is in education, and my program was a very interdisciplinary program, and that's how I see myself as an interdisciplinary scholar. I was very much in conversation with sociology literature in my dissertation, but also used a lot of ethnographic methods. I went back to Puerto Rico as many times as I could to conduct research in Jayuya, but I also engaged in participant observations in Rantoul, primarily at the church, at one of the 3 churches that are now led by Puerto Rican migrants. So I would say interdisciplinary scholar, really pulling from different disciplines, especially in the 2007 chapter that I'm claiming that is kind of a recovery history, if you will, even though I'm not a historian.
Your interdisciplinarity really resonates with me. You know, my Ph.D. is in religious studies, and I've been trained as a historian of American religions, but my outside minor is anthropology. And so I really identify, you know, as we claim who we are, definitely my method is anthropological, but so like you, and I'm drawing on a lot of things now. I'm in social justice and gender studies as well. And I find that this is probably my most intensely social justice oriented piece of writing that I've ever done. And so I think it's exciting to be in this interdisciplinary moment. I'd love to go back to the meatpacking in rural communities, and I want to hear a little bit more about your work with pastors and what you're seeing, and if you have a sense of how these pastors and communities, whether, you know, in the US and the diaspora, how they're responding to COVID, because what I have seen, at least in eastern and central Iowa and sort of central Iowa, is that it's actually this like broadband ecumenical movement of ministers that are really like on the front lines of, you know, advocating for the workers. You know, they're really behind the scenes. They're doing a lot of behind the scenes work. Like Father Joseph does a lot of work that he doesn't take credit for example, but he's doing a lot of work. He works with the local Methodist pastors. Sorry, my dog is jumping up. Baptist ministers. And when I was talking with Joe Belay the other day, my friend Joe is the chaplain at the Tyson Columbus Junction plant. He regularly meets with local ministers in Columbus Junction. For example, I wrote a follow-up op-ed that I'm trying to place right now, but the Chin Burmese workers at the Tyson plant are refusing as a block to show up. And this really, to show up for work, even though Tyson Columbus Junction has actually made some safety changes that when they shut down for the 2 weeks, they had to, because literally 2/3 of the workforce was not showing up. So these workers, and we see this at meatpacking plants around the country where workers just aren't showing up. They're like, our lives are worth more than a paycheck. And I'm seeing religious leaders really advocating for these workers. And, you know, we hear, for someone who's in Catholic studies, like myself, I have a Catholic studies position here. There's a lot of bad stuff out there right now on the Catholic Church, which is, there should be, because there's a lot of problems with the church right now. But there's also a really strong history of social justice and liberation theology. And what I really see on the part of priests locally and the bishops, the 4 bishops in the state, are really engaging in the work of social justice now. I'm really close with Catholic worker folks here in town, and I'm leading the practicum in the fall for GWSS and social justice, and we're partnering with Catholic worker. Whether or not we do that in person or not is to be seen. But I'm just really curious about like how religious leaders and religious people within the Puerto Rican community and the blanquitos, the whites, how are they responding to Christians in particular? How are they responding to COVID in their communities?
Yeah. So I think it varies, and I should say from the outset that I'm not in constant communication with all of the religious leaders in town. My relationship was closer to one in particular for several reasons. And so, it's been interesting to me as I've followed this story, right? And thinking about people with who I was in contact for a long time, use social media and Facebook in particular to continue their conversation and continue to come together every Sunday, for example, and to lead in a different way and to be in community in a different way. And several of the people that I met when I was conducting research surely went to church because they wanted to, right? Because they felt religious calling, spirituality, whatnot. But there were others who, went because that was a Latino community, right? That was a Puerto Rican community where they could see themselves in these rural spaces that were otherwise weren't as easy, right, to come together in positive relationships, right, if you will. So I think that the religious leaders that I've been in contact with have been doing as much as they can. I'm not sure if they are mobilizing right now beyond, Facebook, beyond sort of continuing to show support and to come together as a church right now through social media. But I'm sure they are. They've in the past mobilized when the 2017 hurricane hit Puerto Rico. People, leaders, religious leaders, Puerto Rican religious leaders, I should say, whose paths might not have crossed completely, were coming together to mobilize for relief, for aid, not only for Puerto Ricans, but for the Mexican community who had suffered from the earthquake the day before, right? And so there are probably efforts that are happening right now. I don't doubt that. But I think too that a lot of people are thinking about social distancing and what that means and how much they can do and not do, right? And we know being in these sort of rural spaces that it allows us more movement perhaps than folks in the city. And Jennifer, I know that you interviewed people about the city, also thinking about that space, right? And that difference. I see a lot of mobilization with the community in general, right? Beyond sort of religious leaders. I think that people are going to social media to share and denounce things that they think are problematic. I know that some folks feel like the meatpacking plant now hasn't been doing what they could be doing in order to protect workers. They feel the company feels like it has. In fact, 40% of their workers had chosen not to go to work, which is interesting, and it really, compares or is similar to some of the things that you're saying. But contrary to that, the company didn't close with 40% of their workers not present, right? And so I think that there's a sort of this back and forth between workers right now, because a lot of them are mad that the company hasn't taken better measures to protect them, whereas other workers are saying that the company has and that they want the companies to open and they see themselves as essential workers. And I think that it's important for us to humanize both sides, right? Like, how do we really understand? Because it's much more complicated than closing or opening or being close together. As you know, probably better than I how close workers have to be in order to work in meatpacking plants. So I'm really following and fascinated right now by the community at large in terms of how they're mobilizing. But I don't doubt that religious leaders are also doing their part.
I really like how you pointed to the tensions between the workers. And we've seen this, right? One of our case studies in class this semester was the United Farm Workers Movement, right? Not everyone was in alignment. Some wanted to go back to work and left. And so I think that's an area that we need to explore more. In terms of like the meat packing and the plant itself, like I said, it was Father Joseph who said, I really think you need to go see the plant. I think you need to experience, because I noticed one Sunday, because the first mass is the English mass, English speaking mass, and there are like maybe 50 parishioners show up. But the Spanish speaking mass is like, 4 or 5 times that, right? Bursting at the seams, right? And there were all kinds of tensions, in this particular parish where the English speaking folks were like, we don't need a new parish. We don't need to expand, and the Spanish speaking mass folks are like, yes, we do, But then I wonder, I kept thinking, well, gosh, you say there's 300 folks, why are only like 100 showing up? And Father Joseph's like, because they're at work. And he's like, I think you need to see, where they work. And I can tell you, and as a vegetarian, someone who hasn't eaten meat for 30 years, this was the hardest work I've ever done. And the hog processing plant was the most disgusting place I can ever imagine. And I get very descriptive in the book. It's a very thick description per Clifford Gertz, that sort of thick description anthropology. But I really try to take the reader into the belly of the beast, if you will, and talking about from the intake where the live animals are brought in to the outtake when the animals are packaged up, what happens. And it's just the most horrific job. And my friend Joe Blay, who's the chaplain, likens it to like PTSD. So a lot of the workers have PTSD. It's just, they wake up crying and sweating. And I hear some people I interviewed, because they hear the saws, they hear the animals crying. And it's just, if I can get that across in my work, like the horror of this job, and also how highly skilled it is. Like, these are skilled workers, and we call it like unskilled labor, right? But it's like the most skilled work. And the one thing that I think about in this pandemic, I just want to try to get people to empathize more, and if I had one mission as a scholar, it's to get my readers to empathize, like folks who are like maybe for the wall or whatever. Well, if you're for the wall, who's going to package your meat? Who do you think is going to work at the plant? Because there's not a lot of white folks at the plant. And if there are, they're in the clean offices that smell like Febreze upstairs. They're not on the line.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, in terms of like where you are with your work, like if you had a goal with your, I'm going to call it a book now. It's not your dissertation, it's your book. Like, what would your goal be? And like, has COVID changed it at all?
I saw recently a post I was sharing with you all earlier about someone who posted on Facebook and said that it's the first time that a disaster hasn't made Puerto Ricans want to leave to the United States, right? And that really stuck with me, because typically that's how things have been spoken about, and indeed how things have been happening. With the earthquake that started in January 7th, and that has recently just hit the southern area of Puerto Rico this past Sunday again, right? And more damages. So movement isn't going to be stopped, I think, even though we have seen how the pandemic for sure is not entirely one that is pushing or like making people feel like they have to leave. But I want to, in the words of Dr. Bettina Love, who is an education scholar, she wrote a piece recently, and one of the things that she says, and I just want to read this because I think it's a beautiful way to think about our research moving forward. She wrote that the impossible is becoming possible, and that as we all stand in the midst of a world crisis, those of us who can dream must dream. And that has really stuck with me, because when all of this started, I realized that another world is really possible, right? With everything that everybody has been doing in corporations and groups and individuals to really make things affordable, accessible, free, available. I really want to imagine perhaps even if people leave Puerto Rico, right, because they, for whatever reason they might have, that returning back to Puerto Rico is always an option, but that being over here isn't necessarily in contentions in the way that in the past perhaps people might have thought, no? And I'm always for trying to get people to really rethink how they place value on folks and experiences. And I think the rural is part of that, right? The way that we imagine rural spaces, the way that we think that, especially after 2016, who lives in the rural, who is working in the rural, and the knowledge that these communities bring is something that I'm very much invested in. And I think that with the pandemic, we're seeing how people really do know how to navigate and negotiate these non-urban spaces, and what they do for folks, right? Not that their value has to be placed on the productivity that they give, right? Whether it's the meatpacking plants or elsewhere, but to really remind ourselves that another world is possible and that we do have to assign value differently.
Thank you, Lisa. Kristy, did you have a final thing? I don't want to cut you off.
I just wanted to say that's a great place, I think, to end what Lisa just offered. And I'm going to have to look at Dr. Love's work. Love Dr. Love. It's great. It's like, how appropriate. Yeah. Thank you.
I can send you the link, Jennifer, so you can add
Put it
that.
in the notes. Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be wonderful. Yeah, anything either of you want, I can put links in. So thank you both so much. And I mean, just that sense of raising empathy and the what is possible. I'm definitely feeling that right now. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the opportunity. And thank you, Lisa. We'll keep talking. I'm super excited about your work.
Thank you. Me too.